Today it's point motors, but am I the last person on the planet to discover the MP1s and the MP5s and their usefulness as a surface mounted point motor? Hi, welcome back to Chadwick Model Railway. I'm Charlie, and a couple of weeks ago I installed the TMD on top of the second Helix, and I made an awful mistake. And as you can see here, this lovely tortoise point motor and the board are actually sitting on top of the upline. What could possibly go wrong with that? So what can I do to get around it? Now firstly, let's talk about size. Now it's pretty obvious for all to see that if size is an issue, then clearly the tortoise or the Cobalt IP Digitals are not going to be able to compete with the MP1 or the MP5. They are considerably smaller and they are somewhat cheaper, as an aside, always worth noting. So before we get stuck into the detail of taking these apart and everything else, what's the fundamental difference between these two units? Well, the MP1 is obviously a slow action switch machine, and it has three terminals, a common, a positive one and a positive two to operate the mechanism, and also one internal switch, ideal for switching something like the frog of a point or perhaps a signal. Whereas the MP5 has a more powerful motor. It has a separate terminal, which is quite useful, so you can poke your wires in there, and then that then fits into this rather than trying to fiddle it out in place, which is a useful asset. And it has two internal switches, so you can switch, let's say, your frog if you're into electro frog points, and also a signal or perhaps a feedback circuit into a computer system such as Train Controller or iTrain to let the system know that the point is actually changed. Well, that's the basics, but how do they work? Right, now I'm going to show you how to wire this up one exactly. Now you might be an expert in this field already, and you know this is all easy, all straight sort of guff to you, but to a lot of people it isn't. So what I intend to do is show you wire by wire how to replicate this at home if you've never used slow action point motors, or in fact point motors might be a new thing to you. So we'll focus in exactly how I've done this so we can all learn and move on, and hopefully if you've never done this sort of thing before, it'll give you the confidence to have a go. These point motors run off both AC and DC, and you need between 8 and 16 volts. I'm just going to use 12 volts DC coming off this Gauge Master power supply. And here are the power cables coming in from the Gauge Master transformer on a red and a black. Now I'm going to make no assumptions whatsoever about the knowledge that you have prior to going into this sort of thing, because you may never have used a point motor in your life and you may know nothing about it. So let's assume that we're all novices at this and we really are going in quite cold. Right, so you need a switch to switch the machine. So what sort of switch do you need? Well, you need something known as a single pole double throw switch, and that's precisely what this is. You can see there are three terminals, and the center one is the single pole, and the double throw means this has two positions and it's switching, it's connecting the conductivity from the black to the blue or from the black to the yellow, depending on which way the switch is switched. When we come down to the MP1, the red cable from the transformer is going in to the positive common terminal, whereas the blue and the yellow coming from the switch are going into POS 1 and POS 2. It doesn't matter which way around you put these in, it'll work on either way. So what happens then? Well, quite simply, you turn the switch and you can see the mechanism move. All straightforward. As this switch makes, then on the back of here you can see the other three terminals which would go out normally to the frog of an electro frog point. And when the point is thrown, then the switch inside moves or connects from aux1 to one of these two lines. So on aux1 you would put in your green frog wire, whereas track power would go into the other two. If you connect it up and find you've got a short on the frog, it normally means that these two wires are the wrong way around. Now looking at this image, the red is going into the positive common, and the POS1 and POS2 are shown in black cables. Looking over to the other switch there, the frog cable on this image is coming in on a purple, and then the track power A and B are in the other two terminals. All straightforward stuff. But if you don't have electro frog points, you're on initial frog points, what can you use that switch for? Well, you could use it for a signal. Now remembering that this switch assembly here is dead, it needs power. So I've brought in another 12 volts positive from the Gauge Master controller into aux1. And then obviously it will switch between one or the other output. Now, not rocket science, I've got a red cable and a green cable. So clearly one of those should be red and one's green. Now, obviously you can see the green lights on now, so the circuit must have been completed. And we've got a black cable coming in from the Gauge Master transformer through a resistor, which will drop the voltage down from 12 volts to around about 3 volts, which is the working voltage of these LEDs. Now, if I then change the point, you'll hear the point motor run and the signal change. So now we're on red and to green. And if for some reason they're the wrong way around, you would just simply change these cables around on the terminal. So, all makes perfect sense if you're into signals and not electro frog points. Now my good friend Richard, he uses the MP1s, and as you can see here, he is wiring on point number 28, and you can see the green frog wire and the red and black track power coming in. However, when we look at those other terminals, they feed back to a device known as a DigiKeys DR4018, because he's into computer control via iTrain. And those cable colours are yellow for the common and purple and brown for the POS1 and POS2. So by throwing a couple of buttons or whatever on iTrain, he can operate this point and of course switch the frog at the same time. But what if you want even more functionality? Well, that takes us on to the MP5. Now hopefully you're aware of the TMD area and its layout, and in particular the Y-shaped point that's going to feed the tracks into shed 2. Now I know you can't see from here, but directly underneath here is the Helix, and should there be anything wrong with a point motor mounted under here, there is no way in the world that I can change that point motor, even if I use an MP5. I certainly couldn't use a tortoise or anything else because the clearances aren't there. So what I need to do is mount an MP5, because it gives me the feedbacks I require, as a surface mounted point motor and put it in this area here where I can hide it underneath a building. Now, prior to installing the MP1 and the MP5, there's an adjustment to be made inside the mechanism to suit your gauge, and it's all based on the length of throw of your switch blades on your points. Now, I know that OO and HO throw 3 millimeters, so we need to take this apart and make sure that the cams are set to 3 millimeters. Now, the instruction leaflet is quite straightforward. And as you can see here, the MP5 can be set to 9, 3, 6 or 12 millimeter length of throw, whereas the MP1 can only set to 3, 6 or 9. So if you need a 12 mil, you definitely have to go and buy the MP5. And the instruction says unscrew the 3 screws on the bottom of the housing. Well, that's been superseded. There are now only 2 screws on the underside. So if I take those out, I'll also disconnect that plug for a moment, take those 2 screws out, and this lifts away. Inside, just sort of interest, there is the servo motor and the contacts, and then this cam runs around. Next thing to remove is the slider assembly. So the slider assembly comes off, and now hopefully you can see this very small sort of spigot. Now that spigot needs to be placed into the 3mm position. Now if I'm going back to the leaflet, hopefully you can see that there's a gap here where the 9mm is seen to be further away from the outside of the boss, and coming here you can see that that is the bigger gap here. So that hole there must be the 3mm hole, so we need to take out this spigot and put it into here. Now, just a matter of interest, you get a small bag with these. Obviously you get the instructions and you get the throw bar, but you do get a spare spigot should you lose it, because if you lose that one, then the whole thing is sort of written off. Now I'm going to use a small set of pliers to try to pull it out. And there it comes. Straightforward, but you just have to take a bit of care. Now it needs to go back into the 3mm hole, which is this one here. It's a fiddly little thing. And there we are. Now to reassemble, we know where the lug is on the front of here. Well, on the faceplate there is a vertical groove, and needless to say, that vertical groove goes over the lug, and then we've got a little bit of a fiddly bit now of putting this plate back on. There's a couple of hooks at the back which slide on, and that hopefully it should all drop into place. I know this can be a little bit fiddly. And there we have it. All well. So pop the 2 screws back in and we're ready to go. Champion. Now to achieve the functionality of this, obviously we need to connect the MP5 to the point switchblade. So what I've used is a piece of 1mm piano wire, and this is all available on eBay, it's no big deal. And as you can see, I've lifted the point and I've inserted the piano wire into the hole through a 90-degree turn, and then cut a groove in the cork coming back towards where this will go. So then it's a case now of inserting the plug and then sizing up where I want this to sit. Now I want it to sit as far back as possible because I have to sort of camouflage it, and just let's use this building as a sort of an example, because I've got a retaining wall to go around the back here. So hopefully you can see there that this sort of structure should cover this area, and we ought to be reasonably good to go. This structure is a bit big, so hopefully I can find something a little more smaller and suitable. Right, so now I've got to connect this wire and bend it through 90 degrees and then put it into the MP5. Once that's in place, I shall secure the MP5 down and then we'll give it a go. Now, whilst I remember, I have not removed the spring from this point. Normally with tortoise and cobalt point motors, they're from DCC, then you would remove the spring. Now, I'm unsure about this, so I'm going to leave the spring in rather than remove it and find that I need the spring. So we'll leave that in. So now I need to measure this up, bend the piano wire as it were, and attach it into here and attach this to the baseboard. Now the next thing is to put it roughly in position and remove this front screw, which allows the attachment of the armature wire. Now if you were going straight through your baseboard, then the armature wire that comes in the packet would just go straight down vertically, or in effect it would just come straight up now through your baseboard and through the centre of your point. But obviously this is a little bit different here, being a surface mount. So I need to bend this wire now through 90 degrees, and I think I need to bend it about here. Now there are two grooves I can see that are cut into this faceplate, and this back one towards me is bigger than the front one. So obviously it's the bigger one for this size of wire, and if you've got a smaller wire, then actually you'd use the front one. So with a pair of pliers, hopefully, or a couple of pairs of pliers, let's say, hopefully I can bend this wire without putting any strain on that point. Well, it's not as easy as you think, is it? Yeah. Okay, let's try that. Not quite vertical. Okay, point okay. Yep. And then that would go there, still not quite vertical. Perfect. Right, so that's looking pretty nifty. So as the point then changes, lovely. Right, so we need to trim off this piece of wire, trim that off at about here, and then secure it. Yep, secure this face panel. The panel has, I notice, a little dot. So that obviously dot goes into this little hole there. Wasn't obvious until you sort of take it apart, but there it is. Now I imagine things will start to get more fiddly, won't they? Quick rethink, if you put a magnet on the screwdriver, it then attracts the screw. So hopefully this time we'll have a little more joy. Or not. Okay, yep, all good. So now it's a case really of putting this to the board and then obviously motoring it to find out where its ideal position will be. So you need to get some screws in the baseboard. Now looking at this, it appears that the mechanism is over towards me, so the point is thrown this way. Obviously if the mechanism would be over that way, then it would be that way. So I think that's where a good starting point there. So I shall mark it out and secure the MP5 to the baseboard. Okay, now to the wiring. Now the wiring of the MP5 is very similar to that of the MP1, except you have an extra 6 terminals. So just looking at the first terminals closest to the camera, coming up from the bottom there we've got POS2 common and POS1, and the switch there which is called auxiliary 1, which normally for the frog, and those will equate to those 6 terminals here on the plug-in plug, and there's another 6 underneath, which are these 6 here, the lower 6. And talking about the lower 6 then, we've got another switch here, aux2, another dead unpowered switch, and then we'll get into the M2 contacts, which I'll come to as soon as I've wired in my aux1 and aux2. aux1 and 2, the aux1 is quite straightforward really, isn't it? The green for the frog and the red and black for track power. At this stage I don't know which way track power it goes, because if it shorts out then it's clearly because I've got them the wrong way around, but with these little connectors it's a piece of cake to turn it around. So all I need to do now is chop these cables off and connect them up. If you're wondering about the wire strippers, then the number on the side is RS 3822847. You have to Google that to find them. I cannot find a link anywhere on the planet to find those, on Amazon or whatever. Now, these little connector blocks are quite straightforward. All you need to do is depress the yellow shutter and then poke your cable in. So hopefully you can see that if I poke that one down, I insert the frog cable, let it go, give it a tug, and then you can feel it lock in. So I do that to the other 2, and then I shall do the other 3 on the bottom, which is the other aux2, which is the circuitry feedback for train controller. Now all the cables are connected, and one little error I have noticed, this isn't actually 0.84, it's actually 0.83. Lovely. And if you can see here, there's a tiny little bit of slack on this point. Now this is where these MP5s and 1s come into their own, because if you slacken off these 2 screws, you can adjust the position of the throw bar, because you can move this assembly left and right. So by pulling it a little bit this way, I can put more tension on it. And if of course you're drilling from underneath the board and your hole doesn't quite line up, quite often by adjusting that you can take out any error with your drilling. Now I need to change this point, and hopefully when it goes over to the other side and all is well, hopefully I shouldn't have any slack. So 0.83. No, it's firm. So there we are. It works both ways, and all I need to do now is to do a little bit of programming into Train Controller to make sure that the feedback works. So here we are in Train Controller, and if I zoom into the Y point, which should be there if you can see it, and you can see the indicators. Now if I come in and change the point, you can hear the motor run hopefully, and you see it go from light blue there to light blue here, indicating to Train Controller that the point has changed. So if I swing it the other way, so there we are, I know the feedback circuit is complete. Now you may have noticed there in Train Controller that when you click on the point, the symbol changes its direction instantly, but it's only when the motor has run its course that the contact indicator changes colour, indicating that the point change is complete. That makes sense. Right, confession time. God. Now, when I wired this all up, it was all working perfectly. However, and I functioned the point motor and everything else. However, when I put track power onto the layout, I had a short circuit. So I pulled out the plug from the MP5 and it lost the short circuit. So after a little delving around, I realised then that this long Y-shaped point from Pico, even though it has a frog wire, the frog is powered from the switch blades of the track, so you don't need the frog wire, because there is nowhere to cut this point, which you would normally do, and then it would require a separate frog feed. Hence, I have disconnected from the MP5 terminal the green from the frog and the red and black from track power, so they'll be cut back and tied up out of the way, but something worth considering. Now, if of course you're using a DCC system to change your points as opposed to an ordinary simple switch control panel, James from DCC Train Automation has sent me through some graphics that should help. Now, if you're a Digitrax user, then this is the Digitrax DS74 layout. And then moving on to the DigiKeys DR4018 in conjunction with an MP1. And here we have the DigiKeys DR5000 and DR4088, and again in there with an MP5. Then moving over to Yamork, and they use a YD8116 with both the MP1 and the MP5. And also from Yamork, the YD6016LN ground sensor, showing the full details of all 12 of the MP5 terminals. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you do get another couple of bits along with the switch machine, and that is the armature wire, and as I mentioned, that small spare spigot. And here's the one with the MP1, and in place I've put the armature wire. Now, the advantage with these is that you don't need to trim the wire, because when you screw this to the bottom of your baseboard and you put the wire through into the hole in your point, you can then adjust this up or down. You don't need to pop it through the point and then try and cut it and melt part of the point structure. You just loosen off the screw and then drop it down to the right height. It's kind of ideal, really, isn't it? Much easier. Now, whilst I've laid my MP5 there with a little channel for the wire to go in, so I can put a piece of paper over it and the roadway will come straight across it and it will be hidden, that isn't necessarily necessary. And here are a couple of images from Steve Trossel, who uses the MP1 on the top of his Helix, and it looks rather agricultural, but it does exactly what it says on the tin. You don't necessarily need to go through all the fancy bits if of course it's in a hidden area. Now, the channel reached a key milestone the other day, and I'm almost embarrassed to say that it reached 10 million views. I find that number staggering, and I'm humbled by the loyalty really that people have found the channel, and they find interesting, and perhaps, you know, what I intend to do really is to sort of entertain and inspire. I am so grateful. Thank you all very much indeed. So with very little else to say, I'd like to thank my patrons, and if you want to be one, then there's the button to help me with the channel. There's the subscriber button. Remember, subscribing is free, and a video here, and this one is from James of DCC Train Automation. Again, goes into the MP1 and the MP5. Have a great time. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.